Do you have to press anything to go live, or is it
We're live now.
the recording is actually live?
Mhm.
Frank, I thought I'd just cue you if there was any questions. I thought,
Oh, see.
think of it. Okay, well, that's okay, but
Good afternoon and welcome to our Lunch and Learn. This time we are going to be talking with Frank Condron and he's going to be discussing archaeology basics. So this is part 1 of 2 and it's archaeology appreciation. Is that what we called it? Archaeology appreciation?
Yes.
Yes, archaeology appreciation, which we all appreciate here at the Museum of the Coastal Bend. And take it away, Frank. What happened?
Hello, welcome to another Lunch and Learn. I'm going to talk about archaeology appreciation, that's a title. But, and the archaeology I'm going to talk about is universal, but also I'm a South Texan. So most of what I'll be talking about will, when I get into details, I'll be talking about South Texas, but there's a lot of generality here. The things that we talk about are universal. So it's a 2-day presentation. The first day will cover what archaeology is, why we do it, considerations before we dig, setting up the site. We'll talk about the tools that are used, both at the site and personal tools. There's going to be a day 2, and day 2 will be 14 days from today. That'll be February 24th, same time. What we'll do on day 2, first thing we'll do is review day 1. Then we'll present how a dig is actually conducted. We'll discuss the records we make in the field and in the lab, because archaeology is all about records. I'll describe a lot of people don't even know there's an archaeological lab. I'll describe all the things that go on in the lab. I'll talk about report writing. And on day 2, then I'll summarize the whole kit and kabang. So let's start with the definition. Seems like a pretty good place to start. The study of human history and prehistory through the excavation of sites and the analysis of artifacts and other physical remains. That's a pretty good definition because all the words in there are they're pretty meaningful, and we'll talk about artifacts and we'll talk about other physical, so we're going to talk about all those things. What archaeology is not. It's not arrowhead hunting. It's not pot hunting. It's not paleontology. Paleontology is a study of history through fossils. That's dinosaurs, for instance. The last dinosaur was 60 million years before there were any humans. So this is not paleontology. We don't have any fossils here to talk about. Actually, we don't have any dinosaur fossils to talk about. There are some other fossils of humans. What it is, I already alluded to, it's record keeping. One other point I want to make on this slide before I go any further is archaeology, the word. A-R-C-H-A-E-O, 3 vowels in a row, is really the official word, but everybody I know in the US skips that second A. And so you'll see for the rest of the presentation, there's only one A in archaeology for the rest of the presentation. So, how do we find a site? Well, I start with this Texas map of rivers because in prehistory and in history, that's where people lived. And they lived on the rivers because there was shade there, there was food there, there was water there. It's a good place to live. How else do we find a site? I mean, okay, so it's on a river. Well, we find sites by flying over in an airplane and seeing configurations in the land that don't look natural. Like a rectangle would indicate there might have been a building there one time, a historic building. Because as far as I know, most of the prehistory, the buildings, I'm saying that wrong. A lot of prehistory buildings were rectangular. So anyway, you fly over and you see things like that, or you may see those on the land. You may have a foundation from a corner of a foundation from a building, from a structure. Maps. I'm going to show an example of a map that told us where something was. Here's a map. This isn't the map I'm talking about, but here's a map. It's a USGS, United States Geological Survey map. And what it has is contours. It has all the water sources. And it has the contours that show you where there's high land, because people, prehistoric as well as historic, when they lived by a river, they didn't live where it was going to flood. So those are clues. Couple other things we do to find a site is where, supposing we know that we think there was a homestead here, or we think there was an Indian camp here. Well, archaeologists will go out and they'll do a survey. They'll walk the surface and look for things that aren't natural. You find chips of chert, for instance, that didn't come from a cloud. It didn't get broken. And by the way, you can tell oftentimes the difference between a chert flake, a flint. When I say chert, I mean it's the same as saying flint. There's a difference between a man-made flake by breaking chert and natural degradation. So anyway, you walk the surface, you look for stuff like that. The next step after walking the surface is if you might want to do, say there's a lot of brush and thick grass, you're not going to see any flakes, for instance. So you might do a shovel test. Shovel's about that wide, a spade, and you'll dig down that far and look what's in there, screen it, or somehow look, see what's in there. And you'll do one here, and you'll do one 30 feet away, or you can do it in an organized way. That's how you look for a site. Okay, said I'd show you a map that had a clue. This is a map in the Spanish archives that was done in 1689. LaSalle's community, LaSalle's Fort St. Louis, dissolved in 1689, and the Spanish were looking for them. And they looked by land and they looked by sea. And in 1689, they drew this map. That's Matagorda Bay. This is River of the French. So that's Garcitas Creek. This is Fabio Quebrado, which means broken ship. That's LaBelle. That was our first clue where to look for LaBelle. So you do research and you look at documents, and that's how you find a site. When you find a site, should you dig? To dig or not to dig? Do we have to dig? Well, there's pros and cons of, it's a destructive science. When you dig up a site, you've destroyed it. So do we really want to dig it up? The potential there is for adding to our knowledge of the past, clarify historical points, and indeed, when we did Fort St. Louis, we clarified historical uncertainty. Did the Spanish really build Presidio La Bahia on top of Fort St. Louis? It was argued, yeah. Was it on the Vaca River or was it on Garcias Creek? It was on Garcias Creek. So and that was learned by archaeology. I mean, it was proven by archaeology. There's a ton of biblical archaeology going on every day, every year over in the Holy Land. People, and just old civilizations, but the Holy Land for sure, they're confirming or figuring out or giving clarity to things that are in the Bible. So there's a great potential for archaeology for digging and learn stuff. But like I said, it's a destructive thing. So you have to ask yourself, what will happen to the artifacts that I dig up? Will a report be written? Should we dig it or shouldn't we? Next slide. Before digging on private land, start with, it's not allowed on public land. None of us are allowed to go on public land. Now, when excavations are done on public land, professional archaeologists are called in by the state to examine it to make sure we're not destroying the site. But if you're in a state park or something, you can't even pick up an artifact if you see it on the ground. That's against the law. It is allowed on private land. The private, by the owner's permission, the owner has control. Nobody can take the stuff away that is found. It belongs to the landowner. And the owner has control except for if there's a cemetery on the property. And by definition, a grave is a cemetery. And you can't dig up a cemetery without going through your county clerk and getting permission, basically, to do it. And that's not easy to get. There has to be a damn good reason why you're going to dig up a cemetery. Just think, if that's your grandparents out there, what you would think if somebody wanted to come in and dig up their graves. So that's the way it is. So, okay, next slide, artifacts. Another definition, and that's my definition. I didn't get this out of any book. Archaeological artifacts are things that have been affected by man's presence. They're not naturally occurring things. And they're not all error points. Think about a dam that the Native Americans or later immigrants built for various things. The Native Americans might have made a dam to facilitate catching fish. They might have made a dam to irrigate. So a dam is an artifact. Hearths. Hearths, you find a hearth, that didn't happen by nature. We call it a feature. That's evidence of man that tells us something. And when I say tells us something, what archaeology does is not just dig stuff up, it strives to understand what the heck was going on here, how did these people live, what did they eat, whatever. Archaeology is trying to give us knowledge about the people of the past. Not everything that we find is stone, and certainly with With historic stuff, we find nails and ceramics, we find metals, we find pieces of slate that would indicate maybe a slate roof or and in dry caves, some places in New Mexico and West Texas and other places in the world, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find stuff that's old, that's organic, that didn't deteriorate. We find arrows, we find sandals, we find mats, organic material. Artifacts. Dating. Well, the historical stuff is pretty easy because nails. They started making wire nails, today's nails. We call those wire nails, about 1890. And don't quote me on my dates, but the point is there is a date when we started making them. If you find this, you know how old the context is in which you're exploring. And then before the wire nails, you had cut nails. Well, they're still making cut nails today that are used for flooring, but they went back to about maybe 1840, something like that. And before that, nails were forged. So if you find a forged nail, it's not from the 20th century. So that's how we date some artifacts, historic artifacts. And ceramics are the same way. We could trace ceramics back to where they came from, where the clay, or where the stuff was produced from their content. And we can date, depending on, here for Native American stuff, depending on how the material of the pot was made, we can pretty much date it. Which ceramics don't go back very far, and I'll talk about that when I talk about arrowheads. Okay, prehistoric is a different story. We can find it with associated organic material. You can test for carbon-14, which is an isotope of carbon, and it decays at a certain rate. So with that, you find a piece of charcoal next to an arrow point, you know about when that arrow point got deposited there. The type of, for instance, projectile points. My whole next slide is going to talk about projectile points. So the type is diagnostic. We call them diagnostic artifacts because the style of the artifact tells us how old they are. And then there's another way that we can actually soil OSL, optically stimulated luminescence. Quartz crystals, you can measure how long they've been in the dark. So if you take a sample back behind this artifact that you found in the wall of an excavation and measure that, it'll tell you how old this artifact is. Or tell you possibly that's how old it is. That's OSL, easy for you to say. Okay. I said I was going to talk about projectile points. What we've got here is a whole bunch of different styles. Projectile points were like ladies' shoes. They changed over the years. And I want to point out some stuff. We've got associated dates. These are all diagnostics. These are diagnostic because we know how old they are from the previous slide. They've been found associated with something, or they've been with OSL, or somehow these are dated. We call them diagnostics. And there's the dates that are associated with these different kinds, which each one of these is named. They've got names. You can't read the names there, but my point is they've got names. It makes it easy for archaeologists to talk to each other, the names. And we divide history, and by the way, this is specifically for our area. This is in the South Texas timeline. We divide it into certain periods. It's professional talk. It's for communication. What does every artifact there on that page have in common? They're all pointed on one end. That doesn't tell us much, does it? That's called the distal, the point, the working end is the distal. The other end we call the proximal. The proximal is what's different, and that's what tells us how old they are. That tells us what type they are. So we call the distal the working end, and the other end the smart end. Proximal is the smart end. Okay, I told you they all had names. How did they get their names? We know the name of historic tools because we named them. How did prehistoric? Well, this is called a Mortise Point. It's got this particular, and there's more to it than just this. It's the flaking and the thickness. There's a lot to it, but this is a Mortise Point. How did it get its name? Well, to start with, 41 VT1. What the heck is that? Well, we call it a trinomial because it's 3 parts to it. The first 2 numbers are the state. This is a Smithsonian system. So every state uses the same system. 41 is Texas, and it's alphabetically 41st out of the 50 states. So 41 is Texas. If we ever add another state, that may screw that up. VT, what county do you suppose that is? Victoria. And then 1 is, this is the first site registered in Texas. And where it was, the landowner's name was Mortise. And that's how that point got its name. And here's what we know about it. We know it's a late archaic point. It's 2,800 years ago is when they made Mortise points, 2,800 years ago. And one other thing about it is a lot of points in this area have asphaltum on them. And this particular one, this is a real point that we took a picture of. It may be 2,800 years, yeah, it may be 2,800 years old, but it still has residue on it, on the stem of asphaltum. Asphaltum is a naturally occurring tar stuff. If you walk down on the beach in Texas, you got tar on your feet. And it's not as bad as it used to be because oil tankers aren't allowed to dump their holds in the Gulf like they used to. But it's still there because it's naturally occurring. And the Indians would gather up a ball of tar and they would warm it, heat it up, and use it as an adhesive to tie the point to the shaft. Okay, we're going to talk about another artifact. Golondrina. Golondrina is a Spanish word that means swallow. And swallow as in bird. And it comes, the shape of this reminded somebody who named it Golondrina because it's shaped like a swallowtail. So that's how it got named. That's what my belt buckle is, a casting of that. Golondrina. Golondrinas were made only for a short time frame, and this is older than the Mortise that you saw. They were only made for a short time frame, basically 9,000 years ago, plus or minus like 150 years. So they only made a short time. Next slide is another artifact. The distal on this is what's on the top, because that's the working end. And in this case, the proximal doesn't tell us much, but the whole artifact tells us that this is a gouge. And we don't know exactly what they used them for, but they made lots of them, and they used them for 5,000 years for the same design. So when we find these, we don't know how old they are. They're somewhere between, let's see, I've got the dates here, I think. They're somewhere between 3,500 years old and 8,500 years old. So that narrows it down to 5,000 years. We know that many of them were used to work wood, but we don't know for sure exactly what they did with them. Okay, I got another slide on it, naming. This is a silver casting of an Anaqua point, Anaqua. Now, this is the first arrow point that you've seen today. Remember the slide I showed you with all the arrow points, all the projectile points on it? Just the first 2 rows were arrow points. Everything else, arrows are new. Arrows weren't used till about AD 750. Before that, they had atlatls. They used darts and spears before that. So this is an arrow point, and it has a new name, Anaqua. It used to be classified as a different kind of arrow point, which it is now a subset of that other type, which was a scalar. Had a name, scalar and arrow point. But about the time the book that I'm going to talk about on the next slide, about the time that thing was being written, the authors determined that this was a subset based on examples that they got from Museum of the Coastal Bend. So they basically asked us where we found it. We had an area where we were digging that we called the Anaqua area. And so this thing got named after the Anaqua area in Victoria County. Name and description by Cobalt. And I'll talk about Cobalt later too. This is the book I'm talking about. This is the Bible. If you want to know something about Texas artifacts, especially around here, that's the book. They've got them in the gift room of the MCB. You can probably go online and get it too. Richard McReynolds, one of the authors, is a member of Cobalt. And Richard did all the drawings in this book, as well as all the drawings for us and other ones that I've shown here today. Richard does those. He lives in San Antonio. Great work. Okay. Setting up the site. Well, we need a datum, establishment of a grid. I'm going to talk about what we need to do a dig out in the field and personal. That's a datum that we made. Now, when I say datum, I told you we're going to keep records. Everything has to be referenced in 3 space to something. So you got to start with a reference point. If you're doing this in the middle of Detroit, New York City, there's a manhole cover over here on the corner of 5th Avenue and something, and that can be your reference point. But we're out in the middle of nowhere. We had to create our own. So we arbitrarily created cemented it in the ground and created a reference point. You could just use the corner of a building, but you want something that's semi-permanent so that if somebody wants to come back to the site and follow up on you and do something in the future, they can do that. And plus, all your measurements have to come from a point, because if you don't have that, you don't really know much. Everything is about context and relationships of artifacts. So you need a reference point, and when you do it arbitrarily, you start off and you say, this is 100 meters high. And you say, this is 400 meters north, and this is 400 meters east. You got to have those 3 dimensions. And you start with big positive numbers, because when you go downhill or uphill or over here, you don't want to run into negative numbers. So you arbitrarily start with some positive numbers. What we're doing here is creating a secondary. We've got our primary datum, and now we're 150 meters away from it. Well, we get there with a transit. So you can do it other ways, but you need a transit or a theodolite, something. You need some kind of equipment that will give you angles and horizontal readings. And then you establish a secondary or a tertiary datum. So this is a tertiary. We're actually measuring from something that's in the ground, our secondary datum. We're measuring from that, and we're establishing this is just a rod with 10 centimeter marks on it. And we have a line level, which I'm going to talk about. And the line level is, this is a line level. It's a level that slides on a string. And when the bubble is in the middle, that's this point over here that you're holding and the point over there holding are at the same level. So that's a line level. I'm going to talk some more about that later. And so to establish this, we run it, we get the thing level, and right now we're not there yet. Then we'll just pound that thing down in until this line matches up with something, and thus we now know how high this is. Now, if we want to take measurements from here, we tie our string to one of the lines on there that we know its height, and we read over. I'll go into more detail on that. Because right now, I'm talking about laying out the grid. Because we dig in 1 meter squares. And so based on, there's our tertiary datum, and it's set now, and now it's being used to, got a string tied on, it's being used to measure something. But that's not what I'm showing you this for. What I'm showing you for is these red ribbons that are tied to little pins or nails that are stuck in. Let's see, now I gotta stand back. This is a meter to here to the next one. And then these are all meters. They're rows. There are rows of pins in the ground, 1 meter apart, consistently. That is a grid. It makes a grid. And you do that you can do it with a compass and with a tape. But we do it with a transit and tape measurement. So those are 1 meter, you lay out a whole bunch of 1 meter squares. Okay. Okay, so here's some detail of a 1 meter square. This is where this is being done. String goes around when we get ready to dig, we actually tie a string from each one of those corners, and then we dig that meter. And we dig in 10 centimeter levels, not that much. Okay, we're going to talk about field accommodations. This is the kind of stuff that one person isn't going to bring when they go. They're going to bring a kit, and I'll show you what a kit looks like after a while. But you need shade or shelter in the winter, fencing. The fencing would be if you're somewhere where you didn't want people to come in, where we were at Williamsburg. Archaeology excavation was going on there. It's fenced. You don't want the people walking in there, but people could stand outside the fence and watch. In this case, where we are, we're digging with a bunch of cows. You don't want the cows coming in. The cows are very curious. They're going to come in and they're going to hurt themselves, or they're going to destroy your fencing. You're going to need screens and supports. I'll show you a picture of that. Buckets, I'll talk about that. Bags and tags to label everything. You're going to need forms because remember, you're keeping records. A stadia rod I'm going to talk about. Water is used for a lot of things besides drinking. I'm talking about water as part of the process. A camera is very useful as part of your record. Shovels, wheelbarrows. That's pretty much the big stuff. There's a picture of shade. Screens, and your screen size depends on what you're doing. Typically, a good place to start would be a 1/4 inch screen. And then you need a stand to put it on, although I can see I have another picture that shows a swinging screen. Buckets, and when you're doing more than one unit, everything is color coded. Everything that goes with this unit, these buckets, everything is color coded. So archaeology is filled with 1,000 places to make a mistake. So we have a lot of redundancy, and it's for good reason. It helps us straighten out mistakes that we make. That's something you need in the field. I said one time when some people were going out to a site, I said, no, there's no restroom accommodations out there. And somebody said, or everything's a restroom. Depends on how you look at it. I said bags and tags. The bags are to put stuff in, and the tags, like I said, everything is color coded. So this particular unit that we're digging is north 355, east 999. We're on level 6. The actual level just tells us that's a word to help us communicate. But what's really important is the elevation. 94, I got it cut off here. 9400 to 9390. It's cut off, but I know what it is. And the area where we're digging and the site that we're in, 41 BT 141. And this is the information that goes on things so that it's always tied back to something. The area, the unit, the level, the elevation, well, there's the elevation, the date, and then the people who are working on it. Okay, yours truly, using a line level. This is what we call a stadia rod, and it's a yardstick, it's a measuring stick. And we're in centimeters and millimeters here. The black line indicates that's a meter. So that's 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40 centimeters. And you're using your line level, and that line level is tied to an elevation that we know. So let's say the elevation over here, where my left hand is 100 I'm not going to use numbers. We know that. So what happens is we know how high this side is to the absolute datum that we have established. And where we read that on here tells whether we're higher or lower than the datum. So the bigger the number you get when you read this thing, the bigger the number, that means the farther below the original datum you are. And the smaller the number means that you're higher. Okay? You're reading something over here, seeing how it comes out on here. If the number is bigger, that means you're lower here than your reference point. And if the number is higher, okay? I hope I made that clear. That's how we measure the actual artifact in the unit and find out how high it is. And we measure the top. I said we dig 10 centimeters at a time. We measure the top, and we look for that thing to read 10 centimeters more, which would say when we're done, we're 10 centimeters down further. Here's a finished unit. This is called a storyboard. Something else we use out there that you wouldn't have yourself. And it gives that same kind of information, the elevation, the northing, the easting, the unit number, the site, and the date. And the BD on there stands for below datum. So that tells you exactly where you are. Okay, now I'm going to go through my personal toolkit. Start with this that nobody else uses, but good archaeologists don't need this. I use it because when I'm done, I want the bottom of my unit to be flat and I want the sides to be perpendicular. The first digging I ever did was at Fort St. Louis, and we dug with something that you would use to scrape ice up north. So we didn't dig with trowels. But there was, and we had a lot of hired archaeologists, and there was one woman consistently, her units looked better than anyone else's. And I decided, if I ever do those, I'm gonna do like she did. So that's why I have that, it's a crutch. Everybody knows we use trowels. This is the kind of pin we have in the corner that we tie the string to outline the unit. Everybody knows we use pointed trowels. Everybody, I think, knows that. That's the trowel I use the least. This is a flat rectangular trowel. I use this trowel to get the sides nice and plumb. It can be used for other things. I'm giving some of my personal eccentricities. This is the trowel I use the most. This is a custom-made trowel. It's ergonomically correct for a left-hander. It's one of these trowels that have been bent so that I can scrape the surface, because you're not trying to dig artifacts up, you're trying to find them in situ. And this is perfect for that. Bill Birmingham designed this. He's tried to get the company to make them, but they won't because it's limited volume. Perfect tool. So that's the trowels. Also use root cutters. You don't pull roots when you dig because that might disrupt and change the location of something in your unit. So you cut them. Brushes. I use different brush for different things. Here's a tape, a long one. Here's a short one. We use metric. Doesn't have to be metric, but we use metric. I have a compass. This is a Plum Bomb, and we use this, for instance, if you're laying out your grid and the surface is uneven and you can't get a straight line horizontal measurement, because you remember you're laying out that grid 1 meter at a time. You can use this and keep your tape or your measuring instrument at the shortest distance between 2 points. You can keep it there, and you can drop this down to know where to stick your pin in. When you get into some place where I use it around almost all artifacts. When I'm digging with a trowel and I get to something, I hear a click, I go to bamboo and dig with bamboo. Okay. Here's another line level. Line level is real simple. When the bubble is in the middle, it's level. If it's at one end, the end that it's high, the end that it's at is too high or higher. If the high bubble represents high. Okay. I have some cleanup stuff. I cleaned up my tools. I think that's it. Okay, I did my kit. This is a list by the Houston Archaeological Society, and I included it here for somebody just to know that there is a list. It's more comprehensive than what I've got. It's got other stuff. And some of the stuff they talk about, I talked about as site material, site equipment. There's more of the list on this page, 2 pages. And they actually give some details on, which are good. That's why if anybody ever wants this, I've got it. I'd be happy to share it with them. This is an older picture of our group, our Cobalt group. I don't have a recent picture, but I want to point out a couple of things. The first thing I want to point out is about half of archaeologists are women. This is kind of I'm in the Texas Archaeological Society. Right now, our president's a woman, and about half of the people in there are women. A lot of women go into archaeology. Equal opportunity sport. But I also want to point out some other things. The only guy with sweat on his shirt is this one right here. That's I. This fella, this is Bill Birmingham, who made the custom tools. In fact, he's made, one of the tools I didn't bring, I just realized, is a scoop. He makes scoops out of aluminum that comes from, my scoop came out of the US 59 highway sign. It's now a aluminum scoop that Bill made. He made that ergonomically correct trowel, and he made all these pins. Anyway, Bill, what I wanted to point out is Bill, and this is Ben McReynolds. This is Frank Condron. This is Nelson Mark, and this is Pat Brown. Those particular people are or were stewards from the Texas Historical Commission. Texas Historical Commission has a archaeology department, and it has a whole bunch of volunteers throughout the state that look out for the archaeology of their county. So that's what they are. And all these people, and Judd here, Judd worked on LaBelle and Fort St. Louis. And Bill, who I talked about, Bill has been doing archaeology for over 60 years, probably about 65 years now. So very knowledgeable. He and Ben McReynolds is from Goliad, represents Goliad County. They've both been doing it pretty much all their life. They know a lot of stuff. Anyway, I wanted to talk about cobalt because anybody seeing this thing who wants to get involved, call the MCB and ask, how can I get hooked up with cobalt? How can I get through archaeology? There's a couple other things. Join TASS, Texas Archaeological Society. It is a very professional organization. I'm proud to be a member of it. The South Texas Archaeological Association, STAA, they're they're headquartered in San Antonio. And they put out a great annual bulletin, just great. And they have presentations. They came to MCV and put on a presentation at MCV one time. Okay. Join Cobalt, we're a happy group. Okay, here's what I said I was going to talk about, and here's what I talked about, because I'm getting ready to ask if there's any questions. What is archaeology, and why do we do it, and should we do it? Talked about artifact facts, how you can date them, how they get named. Considerations before you dig. Setting up the site. Hand tools and how they're used. Bagging and tagging. How to get involved. Preguntas? Questions? I think we've got some time.
I think we do. Let me see what we've got here. Anything from the room?
Frank, you mentioned specifically a couple of types of artifacts, prehistoric artifacts, Mortise and golden drina. What about distribution of those artifacts? Golden drinas are everywhere, Mortise are not. You want to talk a little about that and how that's determined through archaeology?
A good question, because that's answered in the book that I referenced. Not only does the book describe the flaking and the appearance of that type of projectile point or tool, but it also shows a map of Texas where it's generally found. There's no wall around that, so you can find things different places, but yes, the areas of Texas are in that book. And Golden Drina is a South Texas, some Central Texas artifact. I mean, I just happen to know that one. I don't know most of them. But, and that helps us to type them sometimes, because we're not going to have something that's from the Panhandle, typically. I mean, some things are across the whole state. Some things are across the whole, say, a 7-state region or something like that. And there are indeed points that look like a Golden Drina that have different names depending on where in the United States they're found. Sometimes it's different time frames too. So you have to, that's why our book is so valuable. It's designed around us.
That's a good point, yeah.
Frank, could you talk a little bit about what a visitor to the MCB might see in re-archaeology?
Okay, I missed the key word. What might we see?
What a visitor to the museum might see.
Well, first of all, the museum itself has a fabulous collection of early people artifacts. And I just touched on a couple of things here. There are some, Anyway, and the Museum of the Coastal Bend is designed to show the different phases of peopling of this area and what their culture was like. And so it starts with the early people and it goes through the French explorer, the Spanish, the ranching. Yeah, that's to start with. And then we've got the lab. We've got the lab where there are people in there working every day, showing you what archaeologists do in a lab, and who are more than happy to show you what they do. There also, we have a lot of people come in that'll bring a collection or something and say, tell me something about my collection, or they'll bring a fossil and say, this looks like a foot. And so we perform that service for people who come in. Tell them, no, it's not a foot. They don't usually want to hear that. They want to hear what they want to hear.
And there are a lot of the prehistoric artifacts that are regionally located. In fact, it's always, I like to remind people, this is an archaeological museum. Almost everything in it was discovered through archaeological process.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love we learned so much from Fort St. Louis and LaBelle, and of course, that's what this museum, that's what sparked this museum. And so there's in-depth stuff. And we have a lot of stuff, of course, like all museums do. We have a lot of stuff that's not on display. It's available for research, both in the stuff I'm talking about, as well as other Spanish, French stuff. It's a great research place.
Yeah, and specifically answering a little more detail to Heather's question, you'll find the earliest points found in this area from the earliest cultures that have visited Victoria, Karankawa pottery, how bones were used as tools by ancient cultures. It's a pretty phenomenal way, as Frank has said, to learn the history of the area from artifacts that have been uncovered right here.
Yeah. And did I speak to the things we learned when we did Fort St. Louis? Yeah, I did. Presidio built right on top. Indeed, there's a model in the museum that demonstrates that. And until Fort St. Louis was excavated, you couldn't have built that model. No one would have had any confidence in it. The archaeology established. They built a Presidio with a 16-sided palisade around the thing. Yeah, and it was right there on Garcias Creek. Anything else?
Football's always looking for more volunteers. You alluded to that, but you might remind people, we're always looking for more help.
Yeah, if you want a fun time, you ever thought you wanted to do archaeology, come on down. You won't be disappointed.
Gosh, Frank, I guess you just were that thorough.
I'm sorry?
I guess you were just that thorough. No more questions.
Okay, I'm that thorough, okay. More than you ever wanted to know.
Right. Okay, guys, once again, I am the eternally flustered Dr. Heather Parra. What am I? The Exhibits and Collections Manager here at the Museum of the Coastal Bend. And how lucky are we to have Frank? This is again, Frank Condron, Archaeological Steward and Coastal Bend Archaeological Logistics Team member and esteemed museum volunteer. It is truly one thing to know a lot about a subject, and it's a very, very different thing to be able to explain it thoroughly, which you've really done. So thanks again, and tune in next time, which is February 24th at noon for part 2 of Frank's Archaeology Appreciation. Thanks, guys.
Oops.